Everything will be alright, I promise. I'm scared.
Don't leave me.
What did you do? Tell me exactly what happened.
I didn't mean to. It just escalated so quickly. I don't know what we're gonna do.
I believed I was doing the right thing when Mina sat at my kitchen table and cried. She said, "Why do you always hold things so tight?" I said, "Because this apartment is my life." She wiped her eyes and whispered, "If you love me, you'll stop being selfish." I laughed once, nervous, and said, "Selfish is wanting what someone else bled for." Rafi cleared his throat and smiled like a patient teacher. He said, "Don't talk like that. Family doesn't bleed each other." I looked at him and said, "Then why am I bleeding right now?" Mina reached for my hand and said, "Just listen." I pulled my hand back. "I am listening. I just don't like what I'm hearing." Rafi leaned back and said, "This apartment should stay in the family." I asked, "Since when is Mina my family on paper?" Mina snapped, "Don't make it ugly." I said, "It's already ugly." She stood and cried louder, "You promised me a future." I said, "A future isn't a deed." Rafi sighed and said, "You're being emotional." I laughed again. "Funny. You're the one asking me to give up my home." Mina softened her voice. "I can't breathe at my parents' place." I said, "Neither can I when you say things like that." She touched my arm. "Just trust me." I asked, "Trust you with the only thing that keeps me safe?" Rafi nodded slowly. "You'll still be safe. We're here." I said, "You weren't here when I worked double shifts." Mina looked away. "That was different." I asked, "How?" She didn't answer. Rafi said, "Because love changes priorities." I said, "Love doesn't erase effort." My phone buzzed. It was Amy. I answered and said, "Hello." She didn't ask how I was. She said, "Beta, what is this drama?" I said, "Amy, they want my apartment." She said, "Lower your voice." I said, "I'm alone." She said, "Don't shame us by fighting." I asked, "Who is shaming who?" She said, "Mina is crying." I said, "So am I." She paused, then said, "A man must sacrifice." I said, "Why is it always me?" She said, "Because you can endure." My chest hurt. I said, "Endure what?" She said, "Life." Then she hung up. Mina whispered, "See?" I felt small. I said, "You called her." Mina said, "I needed help." Rafi said, "You see how stubborn you are?" I said, "I see how alone I am." Rafi slid the papers toward me. "Sign. End this." I said, "End what?" He said, "This tension." Mina said, "Please." I looked at the pen. My hand shook. I said, "Say it." Mina asked, "Say what?" I said, "Say you'll never leave." She hesitated. Rafi said, "Don't be dramatic." Mina said, "Of course I won't." I asked, "Promise?" She said, "Why are you like this?" I signed. The pen scratched like it was cutting skin. Rafi smiled. Mina hugged me. Thank you, she said. I felt nothing. Rafi said, see? Easy. I nodded, numb. They left together. I locked the door and slid down. I said to the empty room, I did the right thing. The room didn't answer. 2 weeks later my boss said, we're downsizing. I said, when? He said, today. I laughed because it felt unreal. He said, I'm sorry. I said, me too. I packed my desk. Tarek asked, you okay? I said, yeah. He said, you sure? I said, I gave my apartment away. He stared. Why? I said, love. He didn't laugh. That night Mina texted, can you come over? I went. She showered. Her phone lit up. I didn't plan to look. It buzzed again. Rafi's name. I opened it. He wrote, he signed like we said. Mina replied, I feel bad. Rafi wrote, feel rich instead. My ears rang. I scrolled. Plans. Dates. Laughing emojis. I whispered, so this is love. Mina came out and said, what's wrong? I held up the phone. She froze. I said, explain. She said, you weren't supposed to see that. I said, explain. She cried, you would have said no. I said, so you lied. She said, I had to. I laughed, loud and broken. You planned my life. She said, you're overreacting. I said, get dressed. She said, where are you going? I said, away. I walked into the rain. Cars hissed past. My chest burned. I said, I gave her my life. A horn screamed. Light filled my eyes. I thought, at least the pain will stop. My phone rang again. Rafi. I answered and said, don't. He said, you saw the messages? I said, you sound disappointed. He chuckled. You were always soft. I said, you were always hungry. He said, this is business. I said, you used my heart as currency. He said, you should thank me. She upgraded. I said, you downgraded yourself. He laughed. You'll be fine. I said, I lost my job. Silence followed. He said, unlucky. I said, planned? He said, don't accuse. I said, I'm done. He said, you're nothing without us. I hung up. I stood under a broken streetlight and talked to myself. I said, breathe. I said, stand up. I said, you did what they wanted. I said, now what do you want? The rain answered. I walked faster. A stranger bumped me and said, watch it. I said, sorry. He said, pathetic. I wanted to scream. I didn't. Mina called. I didn't answer. She texted, come back. I typed, why? She replied, we can talk. I typed, you already talked. She sent a crying emoji. I deleted it. I said out loud, no more. My hands shook. I said, I will survive. I laughed at the word. A car splashed water onto my shoes. I said, great. Another horn blared. I stepped back. My phone buzzed again. Amy. I answered. She said, are you outside? I said, yes. She said, come home. I said, which home? She said, don't be cruel. I said, I learned from the best. She gasped. I said, I'm tired, Amy. She said, we will fix this. I said, you already fixed it. She said, Beta. I said, I love you. She said, I love you too. The line cut. I looked at the road. I said, I gave everything. I said, there's nothing left. The light turned green. I stepped forward without thinking. I heard tires scream. I felt a hit like thunder. I thought, so this is the end. Then the world disappeared. I woke up choking on air and sat straight up in bed. I said, no, my sheets were soaked. My heart slammed like it was trying to escape. I said, no, no, no. I grabbed my phone and checked the date. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped it. I whispered, I'm alive. I laughed once, sharp and scared. I said, I died. My chest burned. I remembered the rain, the lights, the hit. I pressed my face into my palms and said, not again. I looked around my apartment. My couch. My table. My walls. I said, this is before. My phone buzzed. Mina's name. I didn't answer. I stared at the ceiling and said, I won't do it twice. At work, Tarek watched me like I was a ghost. He said, you look awful. I said, I feel worse. He said, did you sleep? I said, I slept too much. He frowned. What does that mean? I said, nothing. He leaned closer. You're shaking. I said, can you help me with something? He said, always. I lowered my voice. Pull the HOA files for my building. He blinked. Why? I said, just trust me. He laughed. That's your line now? I didn't laugh back. He said, okay. Quietly. I nodded. Quiet. I couldn't focus all day. My head replayed voices. Mina saying, trust me. Rafi saying, family. Amy saying, endure. I squeezed my pen until my fingers hurt. I said to myself, I remember everything. Tarek came back later and slid a folder toward me. He said, you owe me an explanation. I said, soon. He tapped the papers. This building has issues. I said, how bad? He said, bad enough that people avoid it. My stomach dropped. I said, special assessments? He nodded. Big ones. I swallowed. How big? He whistled. Life-ruining. I closed the folder. I said, thank you. He said, you're scaring me. I said, you're saving me. After work, I went straight to the HOA office. The lobby smelled like dust and coffee. A woman looked up and said, name? I said it. She said, manager will see you. Ms. Lawless sat behind a desk stacked with files. She didn't smile. She said, you own Unit 14B? I said, yes. She said, for now. I stiffened. She noticed. Relax. Sit. I sat. She said, what do you want? I said, the truth. She raised an eyebrow. About? I said, the building. She exhaled. It's old. I said, I know. She said, and expensive. I said, how expensive? She leaned forward. Elevators. Pipes. Roof. All failing. I asked, special assessments? She nodded. Multiple. I whispered, when? She said, soon. I said, how soon? She said, weeks. My chest tightened. I said, how much? She gave a number. I went silent. She watched me. You look like someone who just learned something late. I said, I did. She said, selling? I shook my head. Not yet. She said, good luck. I walked out dizzy. I said out loud, that was it. People stared. I didn't care. I said, that was the trap. Mina didn't want my home. She wanted me to bleed first. I laughed. I said, smart. My laugh died fast. I said, cruel. My phone buzzed again. Mina texted, can we talk tonight? I typed, about what? She replied, us. I deleted it. I said, not yet. At home, I paced. I said, think. I said, slow. I opened the HOA papers Tarek gave me. I read every line. I said, hidden fees. I said, transfer clauses. I said, responsibility dates. I smiled for the first time. I said, so that's how. My phone rang. Rafi. I didn't answer. He texted, family dinner soon. I whispered, no. I put the phone down. That night, I stood in front of the mirror. I looked tired. I looked alive. I said, they cornered you once. I said, they won't again. I imagined Mina crying in my kitchen. I imagined Rafi smiling. I imagined Amy calling. My throat tightened. I said, I won't beg. I said, I won't fold. I said, I won't die quietly. I leaned closer to the mirror and said, if they bring a knife, I'll choose when it cuts. My reflection didn't look brave. It looked determined. I sat on the bed and let the memories hit. The signature. The layoff. The messages. The rain. I hugged myself and said, it was real. I said, it already happened. I said, but I'm here. My phone buzzed again. Mina sent, I miss you. I typed, we'll talk. I didn't send it. I erased it. I said, not tonight. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said, this time, I watch. I said, this time, I wait. I said, this time, I survive. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the city. I said, I'm awake now. I said, and I'm not giving them my throat. Mina knocked exactly at 7. I checked the clock and laughed under my breath. I said, right on time. When I opened the door, she was already crying. I can't stay at my parents' house anymore, she said. I can't breathe there. Rafi stood behind her with his hands folded like he was attending a funeral. He said, we're worried about her. I stepped aside and said, come in. Mina sat on the couch and wiped her eyes. Your apartment feels like peace, she said. I nodded slowly. Peace costs something. She sniffed. Why do you always talk like that? I said, because words matter. Rafi sat across from me and sighed. We don't want conflict. I said, conflict already happened. Mina looked at me sharply. Why are you cold? I said, because I'm listening. She leaned forward. I just need stability. I said, so did I. Rafi smiled. This place should stay in the family. I asked, and you decided she's family? Mina grabbed my hand. Please. I looked at her fingers and remembered signing my life away. I pulled my hand back. I said, "You want the apartment?" Her crying paused for half a second. Yes. I said, "Fine. I'll give it to you." Her eyes lit up too fast. Rafi relaxed. Mina said, "Really?" I nodded. Really. She reached for me, smiling through tears. I raised my hand. One condition. Rafi stiffened. What condition? I said, "You take full HOA responsibility." Mina blinked. What? I said, "All fees. All future special assessments. Everything." The room went quiet. Mina's smile cracked. That's not fair. Rafi jumped in. That's not how gifts work. I leaned forward. Then it's not a gift. Mina stood. Why are you being difficult? I whispered, because I'm finally awake. She grabbed my arm and hissed, "You're ruining this." I said, "You ruined it already." Rafi laughed nervously. You're overthinking. I said, "I'm thinking clearly for the first time." Mina crossed her arms. You never mentioned HOA before. I said, "You never asked." Rafi said, "This is unnecessary." I said, "So is pressure." Mina said, "If you loved me," I cut her off. Don't. She froze. I said, "Say something else." She swallowed. I need this. I said, "Then you take it fully." Rafi leaned closer. You'll regret this. I smiled. I already regretted the other version. Mina frowned. What version? I said, "The one where I trusted you." She looked away. Stop being dramatic. I said, "Stop pretending." Silence stretched. Mina sighed. Fine. Rafi snapped, "Mina," she raised a hand. "I'll handle it." She looked at me. You're still giving it? I said, with the rope attached. She didn't understand. That was fine. I pulled out my phone and called Hina. She answered, "Hello?" I said, "I need a clean transfer." She said, "Now?" I said, "Yes." Mina rolled her eyes. Rafi scoffed. I put Hina on speaker. She said, "Who's receiving the property?" Mina said, "I am." Hina said, "Then HOA responsibility transfers same day." Rafi said, "That's negotiable." Hina replied, "It's not." Mina frowned. All fees? Hina said, all. Mina said, even future ones? Hina said, especially future ones. Mina hesitated. I watched her calculate. Greed 1. Hina emailed the papers. I printed them. Mina skimmed fast. Rafi whispered, "Slow down." Mina snapped, "I can read." I said, "Read the clauses." She rolled her eyes. You think I'm stupid? I said, "I think you're rushed." She signed. The pen clicked. My chest felt light and heavy at once. Rafi stared at the signature. You'll regret this, he said again. I said, I already survived worse. Mina stood. So it's done? I nodded. It's done. She smiled thinly. Good. She didn't hug me. They walked out together. I locked the door behind them. My legs gave out. I slid down the wall and laughed. I laughed until my throat hurt. Then I cried. I said, I did it. I wiped my face and said, I didn't beg. I looked around my apartment and whispered, I'm still here. My phone buzzed. Mina texted, you didn't have to be cruel. I deleted it. I said out loud, cruel was letting me drown. I stood up and breathed. I said, for the first time, I'm driving. I looked at the door and said, good luck. My hands stopped shaking. I didn't feel happy. I felt in control. That was enough. Mina stopped crying after the papers were signed. She stopped pretending fast. A week later, my phone buzzed with a notification. I opened it and saw her smiling at a cafe table, captioned, New Beginnings. I said out loud, of course. Another photo followed. The apartment. My apartment. Sunlight on the balcony. She texted me right after. See? This is what love looks like. I stared at the message. I didn't reply. I locked my phone and said, enjoy it. I kept going to the HOA office. Ms. Lawley saw me so often she stopped asking why. She said, you again. I said, me again. She slid files across the desk. The elevators are failing. I nodded. She said, the pipes are worse. I nodded again. She said, the roof leaks. I said, I know. She studied me. You're calm. I said, I prepared. She said, the board will vote soon. I asked, on what? She said, a special assessment. I leaned back. How big? She gave the number. I pretended to be shocked. That's serious. She didn't smile. It always is. Outside, I breathed slowly. I said, small bites first. Mina kept posting. New clothes. New dishes. New curtains. I muted her. Rafi didn't stay quiet. He called me one afternoon. You look pathetic now, he said. You gave her everything. I smiled into the phone. I gave her exactly what she wanted. He snorted. You're broke. I said, not yet. He said, you'll come begging. I said, you already tried that. He hung up. The first HOA notice arrived 3 days later. Mina called me immediately. Why is the fee higher? She shouted. I said, ask the HOA. She said, they said it's normal. I said, then it's normal. She snapped, you knew about this. I said, you own the apartment. She screamed, don't twist things. I kept my voice low. Read your papers. She went quiet. Then she cried. I can't afford this. I said, neither could I. She yelled, you ruined my life. I whispered, no, Mina. You just met the real price. She hung up. Tarek called me that night. Be careful, he said. People like her don't lose quietly. I said, I know. He asked, how are you holding up? I said, breathing. He paused. That's something. I said, it's everything. After the call, I opened my laptop. I checked my savings. Not great. I checked job listings. Some hope. I closed my eyes and counted my breaths. I said, this isn't revenge. I said, this is survival. Another week passed. The second notice came. Bigger. Mina didn't post that day. She called again. They raised it again, she said. I asked, did you read the board update? She said, why would I? I said, because it's your building. She snapped, you're enjoying this. I said, I'm staying alive. She said, you're heartless. I said, you taught me. Rafi tried again. He showed up at my work. He leaned against my desk and said, you think you're smart? I said, I think I'm awake. He said, Mina is stressed. I said, she planned that. He lowered his voice. You should help her. I said, why? He said, family. I laughed. You only say that when you want something. His smile faded. You'll regret this. I said, I already regretted trusting you. He walked away stiff. That evening, Ms. Lala called me. The vote passed, she said. I said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. It had to happen. I asked, when do notices go out? She said, tomorrow. I thanked her and sat in silence. My phone buzzed all night. Missed calls. Messages. I didn't answer. I lay on my bed and listened to my heart slow down. In the morning, Mina finally texted. Please talk to me. I typed, about what? She replied, this fee is insane. I wrote, it's your apartment. She sent, I trusted you. I stared at the words. I typed, so did I. She didn't respond. I felt tired, not proud. I said, keep breathing. At lunch, Tarek asked, you okay? I said, I'm learning. He said, about what? I said, how expensive silence is. He nodded like he understood. After work, I walked home instead of taking the bus. I needed air. I said, you're not chasing her downfall. I said, you're building your own footing. I checked my bank app again. I checked job emails again. One interview request sat unread. I smiled. Good timing. That night, Mina called crying again. I can't sleep, she said. I said, neither could I. She said, you're cruel. I said, cruel was letting me carry this alone. She whispered, help me. I closed my eyes. Read the notices. She sobbed. I ended the call gently. I sat at my table and opened a notebook. I wrote numbers. Plans. Names. I said, I won't drown. I said, I won't rush. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, I finally felt steady. The fees had started small. Now they were biting. And I was still standing. Rafi started showing up everywhere, like he had nothing better to do than watch me breathe. He came to my office one afternoon and leaned against the doorway like it was casual. He smiled and said, relax. I'm just visiting. I didn't stand up. I said, you don't work here. He chuckled. Still touchy. I said, say what you came to say. He lowered his voice. Mina is under pressure. Help her. Be a man. I stared at him and remembered his hands sliding papers toward me, his smile calm, his eyes empty. I said, a man doesn't steal from family. His smile twitched. Careful. I said, I am. He stepped closer. People who talk too much get problems. I felt nothing. I said, I already had the biggest one. He studied my face. You look different. I said, you look scared. He laughed, but it sounded thin. Don't get brave. I said, too late. He straightened. This won't end well. I said, it already did once. He walked away fast. I called Hina as soon as he left. She said, you sound tense. I said, he's circling. She said, good. That means pressure. I met her after work. She opened a file and said, start talking. I told her everything. The visits. The calls. The tone. She typed while I spoke. She said, save every message. I said, I am. She said, no anger. Just proof. I nodded. I know. She looked at me. You're calmer than most. I said, I've already been dead. Mina's calls became constant. The bills doubled, she cried. I said, read the notices. She said, you did this. I said, you signed. She screamed, I trusted you. I said, stop saying that. She sobbed harder. I ended the call. Another notice arrived. Bigger. The official one. The special assessment. Even I flinched at the number. I said, that's it. I imagined Mina opening it. I didn't smile. She didn't call me first. She called Amy. Amy called me 10 minutes later. How could you do this to her? She shouted. I closed my eyes. Amy, please. She said, she's crying. I said, so did I. She said, you're punishing her. I said, I'm surviving. She said, a man protects. My throat tightened. I said, from who? She said, from pain. I remembered the rain, the headlights, the cold. I said, you wanted me to give. I gave. My voice shook. She said, this isn't what I meant. I said, it's what happened. She hung up angry. I sat there breathing hard. I whispered, don't bend. I looked at my hands and said, you're still here. Rafi texted later. We need to talk. I forwarded it to Hina. She replied, good. Let him talk. Mina sent messages too. Long ones. Short ones. Angry ones. I didn't reply. At night, I dreamed of the road again. I woke up sweating and said, not today. Rafi came back a week later. He waited outside my building. He said, you're enjoying this. I said, move. He blocked my path. You think paperwork will save you? I said, I think truth will bury you. His jaw clenched. You always were dramatic. I said, you always were greedy. He stepped aside. You'll regret pushing me. I said, you pushed first. He watched me go. I met Hina again. She said, this is good. I asked, good? She said, he's sloppy. I said, he's angry. She nodded. Anger makes mistakes. Mina called while I was there. I put it on speaker. Please, she said. He said he'd help. Hina raised an eyebrow. I said, who? Mina whispered, Rafi. I said, of course. She cried, I can't handle this. I said, then tell the truth. Silence. She hung up. That night, Amy sent a message. Come home. I stared at it. I typed, I don't have one. I deleted it. I said out loud, if my own home won't hold me, I'll build a new one from scratch. I slept sitting up. I dreamed of walls that didn't collapse. In the morning, I stood straight. Rafi's smile was cracking. I could see it now. Mina tried to run the moment the fees turned ugly. I saw it online first. A listing popped up with bright photos and hopeful words. Urgent sale. Motivated seller. I laughed once and said, too late. A day later the post vanished. Another appeared. Then it vanished too. Mina messaged strangers, then deleted comments, then begged again. The building didn't change. The numbers didn't soften. Buyers asked questions. Buyers walked away. She didn't call at first. Pride lasted longer than sense. Then one night, close to midnight, someone knocked on my door. I opened it and found Mina standing there with smeared makeup and shaking hands. She looked smaller. She said, please. Her voice cracked. Take it back. Just take it back. My chest tightened, not with love, but memory. I remembered the boy who thought giving meant being chosen. I stepped aside and said, come in. She walked like she was entering a hospital room. She sat and covered her face. I can't do this, she said. I'm drowning. I leaned against the wall and said, that's how it felt. She looked up. This is different. I asked, how? She opened her mouth, then closed it. I asked, when you planned this with Rafi, did you feel anything? She flinched like I slapped her. I had to, she said. I was scared. I laughed, sharp and tired. So you used me as armor. She reached for my hand. I didn't mean to hurt you. I stepped back. You meant to win. She cried harder. He said it was temporary. I said, he said a lot of things. She whispered, I believed him. I said, I believed you. Silence filled the room. She said, the buyers won't touch it. I said, they read numbers. She said, I can't pay this. I said, neither could I. Her phone rang. Rafi's name lit the screen. She answered without thinking. Hello? He snapped, stop crying and pressure him harder. She froze. He kept talking. You're embarrassing me. Her face went white. She whispered, you said you loved me. He said, focus. I watched her crumble in real time. She hung up slowly. He said he'd marry me, she whispered. I looked at her and said, he'll never marry a sinking ship. She stood up, unsteady. What do I do? I said, leave. She nodded like she expected that. At the door, she turned once. I'm sorry, she said. I believed her this time. I didn't forgive her. She walked away like someone leaving a funeral. I closed the door and leaned my head against it. I said, it's done. I wasn't celebrating. I was surviving. The more Mina fell apart, the worse I felt. I waited for satisfaction. I waited for relief. What I got was silence inside my chest. Some mornings I woke up and felt like my heart was an empty house with no furniture. I sat at my table and said, you won. The word felt wrong. I said, then why do you feel like this? Tarek noticed. He dragged me out for tea and watched me stir my cup without drinking. He said, you won. I looked up. He repeated it. You won. So why do you look like you lost? I opened my mouth and closed it. I said, I don't know. He leaned back. That scares me. I said, me too. He asked, do you miss her? I shook my head. No, he asked, then what? I stared at the steam and said, I miss who I was before all this. He nodded slowly. That guy didn't know how cruel people can be. I said, neither did this one. Later that week, I went to the HOA office again. Ms. Lala looked tired. She said, "You're still standing." I said, "Barely." She closed her door. "There's something you should know." I sat. She said, "Rafi has been doing this for years." I frowned. "Doing what?" She said, "Pushing people into bad deals." I said, "How?" She said, "Family pressure. Friendly advice. Quiet lies." My stomach dropped. She continued, "Mina wasn't the first." I whispered, "She was just loud." Ms. Lolly nodded. "Exactly." I leaned back and felt cold. I said, "So it wasn't just me." She said, "It never is." I walked out shaking. I said, "This is bigger." I said, "This isn't just revenge." I met Hina that evening. She listened and said, "This is a pattern." I asked, "What do I do?" She said, "You document everything." I said, "I already am." She said, "Then you decide who you want to be." I didn't answer. She said, "You can let it end with Mina losing." I stayed quiet. She said, "Or you can stop him from doing it again." My jaw tightened. "That means helping her." Hina nodded. "At least enough to get the truth." My stomach twisted. I said, "I don't want to rescue her." Hina said, "Then don't." I looked up. She continued, "This isn't about rescuing. It's about ending a cycle." That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced and argued with myself. I said, "She used you." I said, "He used both of you." I said, "You don't owe her anything." Another voice said, "You owe yourself something." I sat on the bed and rubbed my face. I said, "What kind of man do you want to be?" I didn't like the answer that came first. It sounded bitter. I said, "Try again." I breathed. I said, "I can hate what she did." I said, "And still stop what he's doing." I opened my phone and stared at Mina's name. My thumb hovered. I said, "One line." I typed, "If you want out, tell the truth." I didn't add anything else. I sent it. My heart pounded like I'd stepped into traffic again. I set the phone down and whispered, "That's it." I didn't feel noble. I felt tired. But for the first time in weeks, I felt honest. Mina chose a cafe far from everything we knew. I arrived first and sat with my hands wrapped around a cup I didn't order. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders folded inward like she was trying to disappear. She sat across from me and said, "I don't know where to start." I said, "Start with the truth." She nodded and stared at her cup. "Rafi promised me a life," she said. "He said you were weak and would fold." I kept my voice steady. "And you believed him." She nodded again, smaller this time. I did. Silence pressed between us. She whispered, "I'm sorry." The words hit hard. Not sharp, just heavy. Late. Unavoidable. I didn't rush to respond. I said, "That's the first honest thing you've said." She flinched but didn't argue. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "I brought everything," she said. Messages. Voice notes. She slid it across the table. I didn't touch it yet. I asked, "Why now?" She laughed without humor. "Because I finally understand what he did to me." I said, "He did it to a lot of people." She nodded. "I know now." I listened as she played the voice notes. Rafi's voice sounded calm, confident, cruel. Pressure him. He'll cave. Family guilt always works. My stomach tightened, but I stayed still. Mina said, I thought I was special. I said, he doesn't have specials. She wiped her eyes. I ruined everything. I said, you made choices. She nodded. I know. She looked at me. What happens now? I said, Hina is coming. She swallowed. Okay. Hina arrived 10 minutes later and didn't waste time. She said, I'll be direct. Mina straightened. Hina continued, this evidence matters. Mina asked, enough to stop him? Hina said, if you testify. Mina's face drained. He'll destroy me. I leaned forward. He already did. She looked at me, startled. I said, this is you choosing what happens next. She stared at the table and cried silently. The cafe noise swallowed her sobs. After a long moment, she nodded. I'll do it. Hina smiled once. Good. Days passed like thick fog. Then Rafi found out. He went straight to Ami's house. He shouted. He blamed. He called me poison. Ami called me sobbing. What did you do? She asked. I said, I told the truth. She cried harder. You're tearing the family apart. I went to her that night. I sat across from her and said, Ami, in my first life, I died. She stared at me. I said, this time, I won't die quietly. Her eyes finally changed. Everything sped up after Mina agreed to talk. Days blurred into calls, emails, meetings. Hina moved like she'd been waiting for this fight her whole career. She said, I'm filing everything. I said, all of it? She nodded. Every message. Every visit. Every threat. I said, he won't stay quiet. She smiled thinly. Good. The HOA board opened an internal review. Ms. Lawley called me and said, people are talking. I said, who? She said, everyone. Neighbors I barely knew started calling. A distant uncle emailed. An old client of Rafi's asked to meet. Each story sounded the same. Pressure. Kind words. Family guilt. Sudden losses. I sat there listening and thought, so this was never personal. It was systematic. Rafi reacted exactly how Hina predicted. He went loud. He told people I was jealous. He said I was unstable. He laughed and said I was obsessed. He cornered relatives and said, he's trying to ruin me. Some believed him. Some didn't. I stopped caring which ones did. I said, let him talk. Hina said, people who lie loudly eventually trip. He tripped fast. One night, my phone buzzed with a message from him. You think you're safe, it read. I'll make you regret this. I stared at it for a long second, then forwarded it to Hina. She called immediately. That's not intimidation, she said. That's evidence. I heard something like relief in her voice. She said, he just handed us leverage. I said, good. Mina lost the apartment before anything else finished. Foreclosure moved faster than justice. I heard about it from a neighbor first. She's moving out, he said. I went by once and watched from across the street. She came out with one suitcase. No furniture. No photos. Just clothes. She didn't see me. I didn't wave. It was tragic. It was honest. She chose greed, and greed collected its payment. Rafi's collapse came next. His job suspended him. Then let him go. His friends stopped answering his calls. Invitations disappeared. He showed up at my building one afternoon, eyes wild, suit wrinkled. He said, "You did this." I stepped closer and whispered, "No. You built the fire. I just stopped being the water." He lunged for my collar. Security grabbed him. I stood there breathing hard. I didn't feel victorious. I felt light. The noise faded after everything ended. No shouting. No threats. Just space. Amy came to see me one afternoon and stood in my doorway like she didn't know where to step. She said, "I didn't know." I wanted to scream, "You didn't want to know." Instead I said, "You can't fix the past." She looked down. I added, "But you can stop repeating it." She nodded slowly and said, "I was afraid." I said, "So was I." She reached for me, and this time I let her. A few days later, Mina sent one last message. "I'm leaving the city," she wrote. "I hope you heal." I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't type forgiveness. I didn't type anger. I just let the phone go dark. I said out loud, "I'm done carrying this." Tarek helped me move into a smaller place the next week. He laughed and said, "It's tiny." I said, "It's mine." He said, "That matters." I smiled and said, "More than anything." Ms. Lale called me one evening. She said, "The building is finally being repaired properly." I said, "No shortcuts?" She said, "None." I thanked her and felt something close to peace. Hina met me for coffee and said, "Rafi is facing real consequences." I asked, "Not just shame?" She shook her head. "Real ones." I nodded. That was enough. That night, I stood by my window and touched the scar on my knuckles. I whispered, "I was reborn for a reason. Not for revenge. Not for pain. But to protect myself. This time, I do." I woke before sunrise and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The room was quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I said, "So this is what comes after." No one answered, and that was fine. I made tea and drank it slowly, like I wasn't afraid of time anymore. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No threats. Just calm. Tarek called while I was tying my shoes. "You alive?" he asked. I smiled. "Still." He laughed. "Good. Breakfast?" I said, "Yeah." We met at a small place near my new apartment. He looked around and said, "You look lighter." I said, "I dropped some weight." He raised an eyebrow. "Emotional weight?" I nodded. "And fear." He sipped his tea. "You think it's really over?" I said, "I think it's done chasing me." He smiled. "That's different." I said, "Exactly." On the way home, I passed my old building. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just walked. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I opened it and read, "You think you won." I didn't reply. I blocked it. I said out loud, "I don't need to win." My chest felt steady. That surprised me. Amy called later. Her voice was softer now. "Are you eating?" she asked. I said, "Yes." She hesitated. I'm trying to understand. I said, try listening. She sighed. I am. We sat in silence through the phone. It wasn't uncomfortable. She said, come by sometime. I said, I will. For the first time, it felt like a choice. That afternoon, Hina sent me a short message. Final hearing scheduled. I replied, thank you. She called immediately. You okay? I said, I'm done being scared. She paused. Good. That's when people stop owning you. I smiled. You taught me that. She laughed. You learned it the hard way. I said, I won't forget. I cleaned my apartment that evening. I didn't rush. I didn't scrub like I was erasing something. I just cleaned. I found an old photo of Mina and me tucked into a book. I stared at it. I said, you were real. Then I put it in the trash. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just let it go. As the sun went down, I stood by the window again. I touched the glass and said, I survived. I thought about the first life. The rain. The road. The moment everything ended. I said, you didn't break me. I said, you taught me. The city lights flickered on, one by one, like small promises. Later that night, I dreamed without falling. I dreamed of walking forward without looking back. When I woke, my heart was calm. I checked the date and laughed quietly. Another day, I said. That's enough. I took a deep breath and whispered the truth I finally understood. After Rebirth, I gave her the apartment she wanted. I paused. The HOA fees bankrupted her. I closed my eyes and finished, but they freed me.